The man who killed the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world did not survive the attempt. And yet, he is celebrated as a hero by the very civilization that lost the battle he died in. Think about that for a moment. The Ottoman Sultan was dead, stabbed through the chest inside his own tent on the day of his greatest victory. His army had just shattered the largest Christian coalition the Balkans had ever assembled. The field belonged to the Ottomans, and the man who murdered their sultan in the moment of triumph is remembered not as a villain, but as a martyr by a people who had just been destroyed. History calls the Battle of Kosovo a Serbian defeat. Military historians who have actually walked the terrain, mapped the troop positions, and traced the political consequences across the following century are not so sure. Because the Ottomans lost something at Kosovo that no victory could replace, and the Serbians lost something they would spend the next 500 years trying to reclaim. Not land, not armies, not cities. They lost a story so powerful it became the foundation of an entire national identity.
This is the story of June 28, 1389. One field, two empires, one suicide mission that changed the trajectory of European history, and a mystery that historians are still arguing about today. By the end of this video, you will understand why Kosovo was not simply a battle. It was the moment two civilizations decided who they were going to be, and why the man who walked into the Ottoman Sultan's tent that afternoon may have been the most consequential soldier in medieval history, not because of what he achieved, but because of what he made both sides believe about themselves. Before we get into every charge, every betrayal, every desperate gamble of that June morning, if you are the kind of person who wants the real story of history, the politics, the terrain, the blood and the dust, and the genius and the tragedy behind the legend, hit that subscribe button and join us. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from, because this story deserves to be told properly, and that is exactly what we are going to do. To understand what Kosovo meant, you have to understand what the Balkans looked like in the second half of the 14th century, because what you find is not a simple clash between Christianity and Islam. What you find is a region tearing itself apart, and two powers moving into the vacuum with very different speeds. The Byzantine Empire, once the greatest Christian power in the Eastern Mediterranean, was finished as a serious political force by the mid-1300s. It still existed, Constantinople still stood, but the empire had contracted to the point where it controlled little more than the city itself and a few scattered coastal territories. The power that had anchored Christian civilization in the East for 1,000 years was a ghost of itself, sustained more by tradition than by actual military capacity. Into that vacuum came competing Serbian, Bulgarian, and Bosnian kingdoms, powerful, ambitious, and completely unable to unite. The Serbian Empire, under Stefan Dušan, had reached its peak in the 1340s and early 1350s, controlling territory from the Danube to the Aegean, from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. Dušan had even contemplated a march on Constantinople itself. For a brief window, a Serbian-led Christian empire in the Eastern Balkans was not an absurd fantasy. It was a plausible geopolitical project. Then Dušan died in 1355, and everything fell apart. His successors fractured the empire into competing principalities. Serbian lords who had served under a single banner began fighting each other for territory, for resources, for the kind of local dominance that feels urgent and essential when the larger structure has already collapsed. By the 1380s, the Serbian lands were not one thing. They were a collection of ambitious, suspicious, mutually hostile principalities that occasionally cooperated and more often did not. This is the world Murad I inherited when he turned his attention to the Balkans, and Murad understood something that the Serbian lords did not, or would not let themselves acknowledge. A coalition of suspicious rivals is not a coalition. It is a collection of individual targets waiting to be taken one by one. Murad was not a simple conqueror, he was a builder. He had transformed the Ottoman state from a raiding confederacy into something that increasingly resembled an empire, with institutions, with a professional military class, with a system of administration that actually functioned across conquered territory. The Devshirme system, which conscripted Christian boys from Balkan families and trained them as elite Ottoman soldiers and administrators, was already producing the Janissary Corps that would become the most feared infantry force in the medieval world. Murad understood that durable conquest required not just victory, but integration. He was building something that was meant to last. By the late 1770s, the Ottomans had already taken Adrianople, renamed Edirne, which became Murad's European capital. They had pushed deep into Thrace and Macedonia. They had defeated Bulgarian forces, extracted tribute from Serbian princes, and established a pattern that would define Ottoman expansion for the next century. Absorb the frontier lords as vassals, use their forces to push the frontier further, and gradually convert vassalage into full incorporation. It was patient, systematic, and devastatingly effective. The Serbian lords understood what was happening. Several of them had already submitted to Murad's authority in exchange for relative autonomy. The question was not whether the Ottomans were coming. The question was whether anyone could stop them, and whether the Serbian princes hated each other enough to refuse to try. Here is where we need to correct something that almost every popular account of Kosovo gets wrong. The coalition that faced Murad at Kosovo on June 28, 1389, is almost universally described as a Serbian force, a Christian army defending the Serbian homeland against Muslim invasion. That framing is not exactly false, but it is misleading enough to fundamentally distort what actually happened and why. The army that assembled under Prince Lazar Serbia was multinational, multi-religious, and politically fractured in ways that its leaders spent the weeks before the battle trying desperately to paper over. Lazar was the dominant Serbian prince, but he was not a king, and he was not universally accepted as the supreme commander. The force included Serbian soldiers from multiple principalities, Bosnian contingents under Vlatko Vuković, Albanian troops, possibly Hungarian auxiliaries, and, here is the part that almost never appears in popular accounts, a contingent from the Serbian lord Vuk Branković, whose loyalty to Lazar was, to put it charitably, uncertain. Branković was Lazar's son-in-law. He was also a man with his own territorial ambitions, his own political calculations, and his own history of negotiating with the Ottomans. Whether Branković betrayed the coalition at Kosovo is one of the most contested questions in Balkan historiography. The legend says he did, that he withdrew his forces from the battlefield at the critical moment, dooming the Christian coalition. The historical evidence is murkier. What is clear is that the memory of betrayal, regardless of whether it actually happened exactly as described, became the defining story of the battle in Serbian consciousness. Branković became the Judas figure around whom the Kosovo myth crystallized. Real traitor or convenient scapegoat, history made him both. On the Ottoman side, Murad arrived at Kosovo Polje, the field of blackbirds in English, with a force that was genuinely formidable and genuinely diverse. His army included Anatolian cavalry, the Janissary infantry who had been trained since childhood for exactly this kind of pitched battle, and forces contributed by vassal states, including some Balkan lords who had already accepted Ottoman suzerainty. The irony is sharp. Some of the soldiers fighting against Lazar's coalition were themselves Serbian or Bosnian men fighting under Ottoman banners. This was not a clash of two monolithic civilizations. It was a medieval battlefield in all its moral complexity, full of men whose loyalties were layered, contingent, and shaped by calculations that had nothing to do with religious identity. The night before the battle, the sources tell us, Lazar held a final gathering with his commanders. There was a Last Supper quality to it that Serbian epic poetry would later intensify into something explicitly Christ-like. Lazar knew what the next morning meant. He knew that his coalition, whatever its internal fractures, was the last serious organized resistance to Ottoman domination in the Balkans. If he lost here, there was no fallback, there was no second chance, there was only accommodation. The morning of June 28th broke over the Kosovo plain in early summer heat. The field was wide enough for both armies to deploy fully, cavalry on the wings, heavy infantry in the center, missile troops positioned to disrupt the enemy's advance. Both sides had experienced commanders, both sides understood the tactical situation, and both sides knew that what happened in the next few hours would determine not just the fate of this battle, but the political shape of the Balkans for a generation. The exact sequence of what happened next is disputed in almost every detail, which tells you something important about how chaotic the battle actually was and how quickly the narrative became myth. What the sources broadly agree on is this: the battle was close, dangerously, almost impossibly close. The initial Ottoman advance was met by a Serbian cavalry charge that hit hard enough to create real disorder in the Ottoman lines. The Janissary center held, but the pressure on the Ottoman flanks was serious. For a period, historians debate whether it was an hour or several hours, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Lazar's forces were fighting well, the coalition was holding together, the field of blackbirds was not delivering an easy Ottoman victory. And then something changed. The sources describe it differently. Ottoman accounts speak of their cavalry recovering and enveloping the Serbian flanks. Serbian accounts, particularly the epic poetry that would crystallize the story over the following centuries, speak of betrayal. Branković's forces withdrawing, a gap opening in the line, the beginning of a collapse that turned from tactical difficulty into catastrophic rout. What is certain is that by midday, the coalition was broken. Lazar was captured and executed shortly afterward, probably within hours of the battle ending. The Serbian military force that had assembled at Kosovo was shattered. The Balkans had shifted, permanently and decisively, into the Ottoman orbit. But here is where the day becomes something that no military history can
fully account for. Sometime in the hours after the battle, the exact timing is uncertain, a Serbian knight named Miloš Obilić entered the Ottoman Sultan's tent. He may have presented himself as a defector. He may have claimed to have information. The sources, predictably, disagree on the method. What they agree on is the outcome. Miloš Obilić got close enough to Murad to kill him. He drew a concealed weapon, a dagger in most accounts, and stabbed the Sultan. Murad died of his wounds. Obilić was killed by the Sultan's guards immediately afterward. Stop and sit with that for a moment. The Ottoman Sultan was dead, assassinated by a Serbian knight on the day of the Ottomans' greatest victory in the Balkans. The army that had just destroyed the Christian coalition was now leaderless, in the middle of enemy territory, facing the immediate question of succession. In almost any other medieval context, this would have been catastrophic for the winning side. A sudden succession crisis in a conquered land, surrounded by hostile populations, with the battle still technically ongoing. These are the conditions that turned victories into disasters. It has happened. Campaigns have unraveled over less. It did not unravel here, and the reason tells you everything about what Murad had built. Murad's son Bayezid was with the army. He acted with a speed that the sources find almost disturbing. Within hours of his father's death, Bayezid had his brother Yaqub, a potential rival, strangled. This was not an accident or a moment of panic. It was the application of an emerging Ottoman principle, one that would be formalized and made legally explicit in later generations. The new sultan eliminates rival claimants to the throne immediately upon succession. Ruthless, yes, but it worked. The succession crisis that should have destabilized the Ottoman force lasted hours rather than days. Bayezid was sultan by nightfall. The army held its discipline, the victory held. The Balkans were Ottoman. Not entirely and not immediately. It would take decades more for the full consolidation to occur, but the direction was irreversible. Kosovo was the moment the door closed. What happened next is one of the strangest and most revealing consequences of any medieval battle. The Ottomans won. They held the field, they captured and executed the enemy commander, they went on to consolidate their hold on Serbia, Bulgaria, and eventually the rest of the Balkans. By any conventional measure of historical significance, Kosovo should be an Ottoman story. It is the battle that secured their European empire. It is the battle that demonstrated that their military system could absorb a genuine crisis, the assassination of their sultan, without losing cohesion. And yet, Kosovo became a Serbian story, the Serbian story, the founding myth of a national identity that persisted through 500 years of Ottoman rule, through the chaos of the 19th century, through 2 world wars, through communism, through the violent fragmentation of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Kosovo became the Serbian Alamo, the Serbian Thermopylae, except that Thermopylae was a tactical defeat that bought time for a strategic victory. Kosovo was a tactical defeat that bought something stranger and more durable than military advantage. It bought a story. The epic poetry that emerged in the centuries after the battle constructed a Kosovo mythology that was explicitly sacrificial. Lazar, in the poems, is given a choice from a messenger from heaven: earthly victory or heavenly glory. He chooses the kingdom of heaven. The battle is transformed from a military defeat into a willing martyrdom. The Serbian warriors at Kosovo are not men who lost. They are men who chose a higher purpose and died for it. This is extraordinary. It is one of the only cases in history where a losing side systematically transformed its defeat into the cornerstone of its spiritual and cultural identity and made that transformation stick for half a millennium. Miloš Obilić is the pivot on which the whole mythology turns, because Obilić did something that the poems could frame as an actual victory within the larger defeat. He killed the Sultan, the most powerful Muslim ruler in the world, on his greatest day at the cost of his own life. The mythology made Obilić the true hero of Kosovo, not the commanders who fought and lost, but the man who walked into the lion's den knowing he would not walk out. His act gave the Serbs something they could call with a straight face a blow struck, a price extracted, proof that even in defeat they were not passive. The historical Obilić is obscure. The sources are thin and contradictory. We do not know with certainty whether his assassination was a planned operation.
Spontaneous act of rage, or something else entirely. But what matters, what history chose to preserve and amplify, is the symbolic act itself. A man who sacrificed himself to kill a king, a death that meant something. In a mythology built around sacrificial loss, Miloš Obilić is the one figure whose death is unambiguously, uncomplicatedly heroic. Here is where the story turns dark in ways that the mythology carefully avoids. The Battle of Kosovo was not the end of Serbian independence. It took several more decades for the Ottomans to fully absorb the Serbian lands. The Serbian despotate, a successor state to Lazar's principality, continued to exist as a semi-autonomous vassal of the Ottomans for decades after the battle. Some Serbian lords, including descendants of the men who had fought at Kosovo, served the Ottoman Sultan as allies and vassals. The reality of the post-Kosovo period was not a clean subjugation. It was the messy, compromised, morally complicated process of accommodation that follows most military defeats. The mythology collapsed all of that complexity into a single narrative. Kosovo was the fall. Everything before it was the golden age of Serbian civilization. Everything after it was captivity. 500 years of waiting for the resurrection that the choice of the heavenly kingdom had promised. This narrative was not politically neutral. It was a tool, and like all tools, it was used by whoever held it.
Serbian nationalism in the 19th century weaponized the Kosovo mythology to drive the struggle for independence from the Ottoman Empire. Serbian political movements in the 20th century invoked Kosovo to justify territorial claims and ethnic consolidation. The name of the field where Lazar died and where Obilic made his kill became the justification for policies that ranged from the genuinely heroic to the genuinely monstrous. The most chilling invocation came in 1989, exactly 600 years after the battle. Slobodan Milošević stood at Kosovo Polje and gave a speech to more than 1 million people that drew explicitly and deliberately on the mythology of 1389. He was not speaking as a historian. He was speaking as a man who understood that the Kosovo myth was the most powerful emotional lever in Serbian political culture, and he intended to use it. What followed in the next decade, in the wars of Yugoslav dissolution, was in part the consequence of that invocation. The medieval battle and its mythology did not cause those wars, but they shaped the language in which those wars were understood, justified, and prosecuted by the people who fought them. Murad himself, in Ottoman memory, became a martyr, killed at the moment of victory by a treacherous enemy. His tomb at Kosovo, one of only 2 Ottoman sultans' tombs located outside of Turkey, is still there. It is still maintained. The Ottomans built a shrine at the spot where their greatest sultan died in the moment of his greatest triumph. The field that Serbian mythology calls the site of the Christian catastrophe is also the site of the Ottoman sacred. 2 peoples, 1 field. 2 completely irreconcilable stories about what it means, and both of them true in the way that myths are true, which has nothing to do with historical accuracy and everything to do with what a people needs to believe about who they are. There is a final layer to Kosovo that neither mythology fully captures. The battle decided the Balkans for centuries, but it decided them in a way that preserved, within the Ottoman system, significant elements of the cultures it absorbed. Orthodox Christianity survived under Ottoman rule. The Serbian church was suppressed and then restored. Serbian language and literature continued. The Kosovo poems themselves were composed and transmitted orally across the centuries of Ottoman rule by singers who were preserving something they refused to let die. The Ottoman system, at its best, was not a machine for cultural erasure. It was a system for political control that tolerated a remarkable degree of cultural diversity within its borders. The price of that diversity was submission. The price of submission was survival. Whether that was a good bargain is a question that Serbian history has never fully resolved, because the Kosovo mythology has always insisted that the true answer is no, and that the debt incurred on June 28, 1389, remains unpaid. Miloš Obilic walked into a tent knowing he would not come out. He killed a sultan and died for it. The battle was lost. The field was lost. The principality was eventually lost, and yet something survived, something ferocious and wounded and proud that outlasted the empire that defeated it. The Ottoman Empire that Murad built at Kosovo is gone. The Serbia that lost there is still here. Make of that what you will. History rarely provides conclusions that are both clean and honest. Kosovo provides one that is honest. Sometimes the people who lose the battle are the ones who win the argument about what the battle meant, and sometimes, 500 years later, that argument is still the most dangerous thing on the field.